This is a production of Cornell University.
And it's my great pleasure this afternoon to have Louise Arbour at Cornell for the Bartles World Lecture. She's the 2008 Bartles World Affairs Fellow, and before we proceed, would like to first of all acknowledge the Bartels family, Hank and Nancy, who are both members of the class of 1948, and they established the Bartels World Affairs Fellowship in 1984. It's designed to educate students on the importance of global issues and to give them the opportunity to learn about careers in public service from prominent international figures. The Bartels World Affairs Fellows, who are hosted by the Inequality Center, and at this point, I'd also like to acknowledge the efforts that particularly Heike Mikkelsen and others at the Inequality Center have made to organize this year's program. The fellows give one major public lecture and also spend time interacting with Cornell students and faculties while they're visiting. The Bartels have devoted a tremendous amount of energy to Cornell activities and supported many programs at Cornell, including the Shoals Marine Laboratory, International Affairs, Engineering, Athletics, and the Johnson Museum of Art. As you can see, they took interdisciplinary initiatives seriously. This year, the Bartels World Affairs Fellow, Louise Arbour, is an accomplished legal scholar, a respected jurist, and an internationally known champion for the advancement of human rights throughout the world. She's a native of Montreal, Quebec, and her interest and passion for the law has brought her all over the world. She started as an associate dean and professor of law. She became the chief prosecutor for the United Nations International Criminal Tribunals. She's committed her life and career to upholding the law and furthering the cause of human rights. She graduated from College Regina Assumpta in Montreal in 1967 and completed her law degree with distinction from the University of Montreal in 1970. She's received honorary doctorates from 27 different universities, as well as numerous medals and awards. From her position as Associate Dean and Associate Professor at the Osgood Law School of York University in Toronto, she was appointed to the Supreme Court of Ontario in 1987 and later to the Ontario Court of Appeal. In 1996, she was appointed by the Secretary General of the United Nations as Chief Prosecutor for the International Criminal Tribunals for Yugoslavia and also for Rwanda. She then resigned and took up an appointment on the Supreme Court of Canada, where she served for 5 years. In 2004, she was appointed the High Commissioner for Human Rights by the Secretary General of the United Nations, and she succeeded Sergio Vieira de Mello, who was killed in the August 2003 bombing of the Canal Hotel in Baghdad. The title of today's lecture is Human Rights for All, Beyond Our Reach, reflecting on Franklin D. Roosevelt's 4 fundamental freedoms: freedom from fear, freedom from want, freedom of expression, and freedom of religion. She's going to explore whether these rights are within our reach. These are areas where I, as a person who spent a lot of my career working in Africa and various parts of Asia, as well as having lived in this country and worked in various urban areas, I think are fundamental questions that all of us need to be addressing. So please give a warm welcome to Louise Arbour, our 2008 World Bartels Fellow.
Thank you very much indeed. I'm extremely pleased to be here, even though I have to confess that as I drove, or to be more precise, was driven from Toronto to here this morning, I had a a slightly disturbing experience. I temporarily closed my eyes for a few seconds because we had left quite early. And when, in a beautiful ray of sunshine, I opened my eyes, I saw a sign that said, Geneva. Now, this was rather startling. I thought I had quit my job in Geneva at the beginning of July. So for a moment, I was very disconcerted. There has been a reference made to my various honorary degrees. I thought I should also share with you the most recent honor that was conveyed upon me, for which I'm very grateful, although slightly puzzled. And the reason I thought I'd share it with you is because in a country where healthcare is such an important issue, you may find it interesting to know that I have just been made an honorary fellow of the Royal College of Physicians and Surgeons. And so if any of you need a little pro bono cosmetic surgery, or I could see you happily at the back of the room at the end of my talk. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to start my talk just by recounting, telling you a story, or recounting an event that I think will set the tone for the issues that I would like to raise in my conversation with you this afternoon. Early in the morning of 21 November 2006, I left Gaza City, where I had spent the night, and I traveled via the Erez crossing towards the southern Israeli town of Sderot, which is only a few kilometers away. I had a scheduled meeting with the mayor of Sderot, with whom I had hoped to discuss the situation in this small town, which found itself under regular Qassam rocket fire from the Gaza Strip. Shortly before arriving at the mayor's office, our small UN convoy had to pull over to the side of the road as sirens announced yet another attack. The rockets fell on a nearby poultry processing plant, killing a factory worker. When we then proceeded and arrived at the mayor's office, I asked him whether we could travel together to the site of the attack so that I could see firsthand and get a sense of the trauma that had been inflicted on the population of Sderot. The Israeli ambassador to Geneva, Mr. Lebanon, was traveling with me in my UN armored vehicle. When we arrived at the scene, there was considerable commotion. All the employees of the plant were outside, clearly very shocked and very agitated as they waited for some emergency vehicles to arrive. We arrived in 2 or 3 UN vehicles, and the mayor also came with his own entourage. Now, I heard subsequently that people were upset because our vehicles were in the way of the movement of the emergency vehicles, and this may explain in part what happened subsequently. Obviously, this part of our trip was improvised, and the UN security people were very alert, as they don't like improvised movements, and we were now operating in a very crowded, very agitated environment. The mayor spoke to a group of people, and through an interpreter, I also said a few words. Someone said something to me that my interpreter decided not to translate, so I assume it was not particularly friendly or flattering. Then I was asked very quickly by my security officers to get back into the car as we had to leave. Just as I got into the armored SUV with Ambassador Lebanon, someone threw a rock at the side door of our vehicle. I was very startled, and I did realize that tempers were flaring in the midst of a lot of commotion and confusion. Now, I have to say, I'm not sure that the anger was directed at me personally. In fact, I'm not sure that anyone there really knew who from the UN was visiting. As I said, this was not a planned, pre-announced visit. But in any event, the antagonism towards the United Nations was loud and clear, as was the sense that the government of Israel was not doing enough to stop these rocket attacks. I went from there to visit a daycare center, and I heard parents express their daily fears for the safety of their children. Now, the day before, I had been in Beit Hanun in Gaza, where Israeli army shelling had killed some 19 civilians, most from the same family, a few weeks earlier. I also spoke there to mothers who feared for the safety of their children and who had angry words for their leaders and for the United Nations, whom they felt was totally failing to protect them. Indeed, I was struck by the bitter sense of abandonment expressed both by Israeli and Palestinian civilians towards the world at large. And if the people of Israel and of the occupied Palestinian territory, who live in the midst of one of the world's most mediatized conflict, feel abandoned, what about the family of the man who disappeared in Bardia, Nepal, at the height of the conflict between the then Royal Nepalese Army and the CPN Maoists? Or what about the women and children in the lawless Karamoja region of Uganda, or the rape victims in the Democratic Republic of Congo? Is there any reason to think that they feel any differently? As was the case in all the field missions that I conducted when I was the United Nations High Commissioner, including missions to Bardia, to Karamoja, and to Goma in the DRC, I was always pursuing a variety of objectives, and I was pursuing a variety of objectives while conducting my visit to Israel and to the occupied Palestinian territory. Obviously, I wanted to familiarize myself with the complex human rights situation on the ground, particularly by contacting victims, victims groups, civil society advocates, and human rights defenders. I also wished to strengthen engagement with both the government of Israel and with the Palestinian Authority in order to enhance human rights protection, and I wanted to raise the profile of human rights issues in an environment unfortunately dominated by political rather than by legal considerations. I came out of that mission wondering again whether the international human rights agenda could deliver on the promise that we made 60 years ago, not only that we would never again stand in silence in the face of massive slaughter, but that we would strive to ensure protection for all human rights, for all people. And this is the reflection that I would like to pursue with you today. On December 10th of this year, we will be celebrating the 60th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which has been branded, correctly in my view, as probably one of the most important secular documents in modern history. The day before, on December 9th, we will have just marked the 60th anniversary of the Genocide Convention. Having just completed a few months ago my 4-year term as UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, I do feel compelled to reflect broadly on the question that was inevitably on my mind on a daily basis in Geneva, and particularly in the course of my field missions, as to whether or not we have secured the rights and solidified the web of protection contained in the Universal Declaration. I think it would be unduly ambitious to attempt to review comprehensively the impact of the Universal Declaration worldwide. Many national constitutions, bills of rights, charters of rights and freedoms are directly inspired by the Universal Declaration. Although not always referred to specifically, particularly as it has in a sense been superseded by a range of more specific human rights treaties, the Universal Declaration has clearly been the intellectual blueprint for most of the progress made in the past 60 years on the universal yearnings for freedom, for safety, for dignity, and for equality. And yet, as we continue to witness the daily manifestations of an unjust and brutal world, must we conclude that we have betrayed the promise that was proclaimed in the Universal Declaration 60 years ago of all human rights for all? I would like to tackle this issue under a few broad themes. First, I will touch upon the fundamental concepts of indivisibility and universality of rights. And then I'll examine whether we have set up the proper institutions within which the rights can be substantially developed and practically enforced. And finally, I will question whether the interplay between law and politics is inevitably fatal to the universal enjoyment of universal rights. So let me turn first to these important concepts of indivisibility of rights, and universality. The Universal Declaration is premised on the principle of the equality of all human beings in rights and in dignity. It goes on to articulate the right to life, liberty, and security of the person, and to further enumerate a series of rights that, in a sense, unpack Franklin Roosevelt's inspired prescription of freedom from fear and freedom from want. That unified concept of the legal ingredients necessary to operationalize the ideal of dignity and equality, unfortunately did not survive the Cold War. Post-World War II, the Universal Declaration gave rise to the two great international covenants, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, which in turn came to represent fundamental East-West fracture that has survived to this day despite the diminishing political relevance of the East-West tensions. This fracture is best illustrated by the fact that the United States has ratified the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, but not the Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, and that China, for instance, has done exactly the opposite. The dichotomy, however, has been reappropriated as a schism between the West and the developing world. Developing countries argue that their need for survival is best expressed in economic, social, and cultural rights, such as the right to food, to shelter, to health, to education, and that these pursuits must take priority over the constraints imposed on governments by civil and political rights. In contrast, of course, Western governments continue to be wary of this perspective, as was evidenced by their participation in the elaboration of an optional protocol to the Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, which just completed its work in Geneva last spring. The Western democracies prefer to view economic, social, and cultural rights as political aspirations rather than as enforceable rights, fearing that as enforceable rights, they would either hamper free market practices or impose overly cumbersome financial obligations on states, or both. Thus, economic, social, and cultural rights are justiciable in any sense of that word in very few countries, and even fewer Western-style democracies. And I could think, as the few who do enforce these rights in court, South Africa, France, Finland, India, Syria, Romania, Argentina, and Colombia. Western countries continue to promote those civil and political rights that their political traditions view as the hallmark of democracies, forgetting, it seems, that these rights evolved over time and foolishly attempting to impose prematurely the finished product on countries unprepared to embrace them. The best example of that, in my view, is the promotion of elections, which often serves nothing other than to reduce democracy to electoral politics, or worse, to entrench and legitimize totally unsuitable leaders with no parallel institutions, such as courts or the media, to keep them in check. This situation fosters a climate of suspicion and easy assumptions of lack of good faith by both sides of this debate. Western diplomats engaged in human rights work question the bona fides of developing countries under authoritarian regimes with abysmal records on political and civil rights, but who purport to champion economic and social rights. In contrast, the NAM, the Non-Aligned Movement, the so-called Group of 77, and virtually all other spokesmen for a broadly defined developing world, even when the group contains, as the Non-Aligned Movement does, many healthy democracies, all these groups are very quick to express their suspicion about a hidden agenda in the Western promotion of human rights. In the most strident cases, they denounce Western human rights advocacy as neo-colonialism, cultural imperialism, self-serving imposition of rules designed to protect Western economic interests. In a more subtle way, they also questioned the bona fides of the Western position, which is so reluctant to embrace social and economic rights and so tolerant of the grossest economic and social disparities, both within their own countries and between themselves and the rest of the world. In short, the fracture of the concept of indivisibility of rights, shortly after the enactment of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, has taken political dimensions that render the advancement of all rights more difficult. In my view, the breakthrough has to come from the West, and that is so for several reasons. First, there is no rational basis for the reluctance to articulate a legal framework of protection for economic, social, and cultural rights, and Western countries should ratify as early as possible the new optional protocol to the Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. Second, Western human rights advocacy would be greatly enhanced by broadening its scope beyond what is seen as the narrow protection of democracy. Particularly in recent years, American promotion of democracy is easily equated with the promotion of regime change, which rapidly transforms a human rights discourse into the promotion of political interests and the alleged improper interference in the political affairs of others. And finally, Western democracies need to address their own human rights shortcomings head-on. And these shortcomings are clearly in the areas of discrimination and inequities, which can no longer be addressed solely by political and civil rights guarantees. A major step towards the restoration of the fundamental concept of indivisibility of rights would go a long way in ensuring their universal application. The principle of universality itself is now directly under attack. Even the moderate statements that were made at the ministerial level meeting of the Nonaligned Movement in Iran, in Tehran, last fall, speak eloquently on that point without the need to refer to the outrageously provocative ones. The topic of that meeting of the Nonaligned Movement was human rights and cultural diversity, and the agenda was hardly friendly to the dogma that fundamental human rights represent universal values and are indeed the common heritage of mankind. I'm not persuaded that the attack on the very concept of universality of rights is always pursued in good faith, as it is often expressed most vocally by those who seem to champion no rights, or at least an erosion of the many rights that they believe challenge the foundations of their power. On the other hand, it is not useful either to dismiss without pause the claims that, as presently conceived, some rights are incompatible with religious or cultural precepts that in many societies trump the advancement of individual freedoms. The idea of universal fundamental rights is not adverse to cultural specificity. Quite the contrary. Our common inherited ideas about human rights, which are given expression in the Universal Declaration and in other human rights instruments, derive from a range of cultures, from philosophical and religious traditions, and from different value systems. Throughout the processes that led to the creation of international instruments and treaties, in negotiations, consultations, drafting of documents, representatives of different states, and increasingly of civil society actors are involved. Furthermore, many provisions in international human rights treaties are now recognized as rule of customary international law, which means that they are generally accepted among states as obligatory and thus binding on all states, regardless of whether or not these states have ratified or signed the relevant treaty instruments. Furthermore, developed in a cultural diverse environment, human rights law not only protects the inherent dignity and equal and inalienable rights of all human beings, but it also protects cultural diversity itself. This is so through the interpretation given by the Human Rights Committee to Article 27 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which provides that, I quote, "In those states in which ethnic, religious, or linguistic minorities exist, persons belonging to such minorities shall not be denied the right, in community with other members of their group, to enjoy their own culture, to profess and practice their own religion, or to use their own language." It is also expressly provided in the 1992 United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Persons Belonging to National or Ethnic, Religious, and Linguistic Minorities, which protects minorities' entitlements and the right to cultural, linguistic, and religious diversity within states. So while it is apparent that the principle of universality of human rights is not antagonistic to cultural diversity, I think we must acknowledge that the appreciation of the nature and scope of most rights must be guided by a universally acceptable analytical framework. At the same time, and very importantly, I think, in our own culture, we must concede that there is no dominant or culturally superior point of view that yields in and of itself at all times the universally correct position, particularly on delicate questions that involve deeply held moral or religious beliefs or long-standing cultural practices and traditions. In other words, while both culture and diversity in cultural expressions are rights, neither of them defines the scope of rights. No culture and no school of thought stands above the principles of non-discrimination, gender and race equality, the ban on torture, the right to life, and the freedom of religion, belief, and conscience. Ultimately, the law trumps cultural relativism when it conflicts with the law. This is a good thing since notions of cultural relativism are often advanced to impeach the universality of human rights standards and norms by those whose true purpose is, in effect, to reject both human rights and diversity. Surely, if we accept, as we must, the guiding principle that the preservation of cultural pluralism is in humanity's best interest, then we should always seek a maximum degree of accommodation for competing rights, and we should try to find those solutions that maximize the operative effect of all rights. However, we must be clear that cultural specificity and adherence to religious or cultural norms and practices can never justify state-sponsored or state-tolerated infringements on the rights to physical integrity through, for instance, the practice of genital mutilation or the denial of gender equality that precludes women from participating in their own governance. The tension between universal rights and cultural specificity is exacerbated as societies become less homogeneous and as the international community increases its own engagement in the promotion of all human rights for all. But even among societies that are relatively homogeneous, amongst people who embrace the same faith or have had similar upbringing, there are profound differences of opinion regarding, for instance, discrimination on the basis of sexual identity, orientation, or preference, and even regarding the full requirements of gender equality. Since the enactment of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the concept of equality and non-discrimination has evolved, both in terms of the breadth of the prohibited grounds of discrimination and in terms of the requirement for real rather than mere formal equality. That this debate has not progressed everywhere at the same speed or with the same success is not, in my view, a cause to question the validity of the fundamental premise of universality of rights. More than anything else, it is currently the tension between freedom of expression and freedom of religion that has exacerbated the attacks on the concept of universality of rights. This is somewhat ironic, as these two fundamental freedoms completed the four freedoms championed by Roosevelt at the time of the framing of the Universal Declaration. Through political manipulations of public opinion, there is now a perception in many developing countries that the West champions freedom of expression as part of a general laissez-faire and an erosion of moral values, and that the secular state offers no protection to the expression of religious beliefs in public life, or more precisely, to the public expression of religious beliefs. This criticism is acutely expressed vis-à-vis both the United States and European countries, many of which have a much stronger secular culture than the United States, while on the other hand, the US has an incredibly protective stance vis-à-vis freedom of expression. I believe that human rights advocates must resituate this debate within its proper legal framework so as to avoid a profound fracture in the international human rights edifice. As expressed in the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, freedom of expression is not an absolute right, and its limits are not to be set by the current level of tolerance for speech that others may find offensive in societies that have overcome these sensitivities. The limits on freedom of expression are expressed in Article 19 and 20 of the International Covenant and are not only discretionary or permissive. Article 20 imposes on states the obligation to prohibit by law any propaganda for war and any advocacy of national, racial, or religious hatred that constitutes incitement to discrimination, hostility, or violence. The application of these legal doctrines is hard enough at the best of times, but when the clash of rights is poisoned or even manufactured by political distortions, the conversation is no longer one that can be had within the law alone. And I will return briefly to this point in my closing remarks. Let me now turn briefly to the question of whether we have the right institutions to advance universal human rights. So I will turn to the institutional framework within which the international human rights agenda must be protected. The Universal Declaration was, of course, developed by the United Nations Commission on Human Rights under the intellectual and political leadership, in particular, of Eleanor Roosevelt. And I should pause here to point out that I saw last year at the Geneva International Human Rights Film Festival, I saw the original footage of the moment in the General Assembly of the United Nations where the Universal Declaration was adopted. Eleanor Roosevelt was the only woman visibly present in a sea of men. In fact, the president opened the debate in the assembly not by the usual ladies and gentlemen, but by gentlemen, which is very startling in this day and age. The only thing, in a sense, that I didn't find particularly startling is, funny enough, they weren't all smoking. But apart from that, it's a piece of film that speaks loudly for its time in history. Now, the Commission on Human Rights that gave birth to the Universal Declaration has become very much maligned over the years, and early in my tenure as the High Commissioner, I was party to the process that led to its demise and its replacement by the Human Rights Council. In my view, the profound malaise that led to the abolition of the Commission on Human Rights in the United Nations was twofold. In part, it reflected a dissatisfaction and indeed a bitterness in the human rights discourse in the United Nations that has not and could not have been resolved by a mere institutional adjustment. And again, I will return to that point. But most fundamentally, I think that the Commission had outlived its usefulness as a mostly normative body and had been unable to successfully reincarnate itself as a monitoring body for the enforcement of rights and norms and standards. And frankly, the normative era had largely overrun its course. Between 1948 and 2005, the world had equipped itself with a broad range of excellent normative documents, conventions, treaties, declarations, comments, but the world was very deficient at ensuring that these norms be implemented, that standards be adhered to, and rights enforced. The efforts made by the Commission on Human Rights to transform itself into an implementation forum were not only unsuccessful, but they actually destroyed the effectiveness of the Commission, even as a normative body. when it started to move from the creation of thematic special rapporteurs to creating country-specific mandates, the Commission quickly became accused of politicization, selectivity, and double standards. Country-specific discussions in the Commission were, of course, never welcome by the country under scrutiny, and that antagonism led to the formation of political alliances resisting the specific finger-pointing. By the time then Secretary General Kofi Annan launched his major institutional reform initiative, the Commission was very much a lame duck institution, having lost, on the one hand, the support of many developing countries who felt selectively exposed for their human rights shortcomings, and most significantly, of the United States and several Western countries who believed that the Commission had become a forum of choice for Israel bashing. So the momentum for the abolition of the Commission was not difficult to create. The positive creation of its successor institution, the Human Rights Council, proved considerably more challenging. From the outset, a clash of visions emerged. Led by the United States, some argued for a small Human Rights Council, not unlike the Security Council, which of course was itself suffering from a terrible legitimacy crisis and was very much in need for reform. In fact, a successful reform of the human rights institution was probably a quid pro quo amongst member states of the UN who could not agree on an institutional reform of the Security Council. Now, the small model that the United States was promoting, in my opinion, was unsaleable and wrong in principle. Human rights are meant to be of universal application. The chances of successfully implementing norms by a self-declared and self-promoted club of the virtuous on a mass of adverse and resisting states, in my view, was not a realistic option, unless, of course, it were to be given coercive powers like the Security Council, but let's be very clear that this was completely unthinkable. Some, including me, argued for universal membership in the Human Rights Council. Since all member states of the UN have the status of observer in any event, it was only a question of voting rights. And since the votes tended to be always representing regional consensus, it didn't seem to matter to me all that much who actually voted. But I felt that the principle of inclusion was an important one, as did the need to displace the claims of selectivity. I always felt that it's more useful to have everyone at the table, unless, of course, you have the capacity to override their opposition despite their absence. In the end, the compromise on the composition of the Council was to reduce slightly the size of the former Commission from 53 to 47. No rhyme of reason. This was a pure product of political bargaining. And the Human Rights Council remains a political body. It's not a court, and it's certainly not a faculty of law. Its 47 members are elected by the General Assembly on the basis of the principle of equitable geographic distribution, which out of the 47 seats gives 13 each to the African and the Asian group, and 6 and 7 seats respectively for the Latin American and the Western group. Contrary to the expectations of its framers, the election process was never, and to this day is not, fully competitive, and some regions, Africa in particular, continue their tradition of solidarity by presenting a pre-selected clean slate to the General Assembly for their 13 seats. Yet some progress was made, as candidates for a seat on the Human Rights Council have to make public pledges and commitments to which they can be held, politically if not legally, since these promises were voluntarily undertaken. Most importantly, a new process was put in place to pursue the dual objective of focusing on implementation rather than on creation of norms and standards, and doing so in an equitable, non-selective, universal fashion. That process, which is called the Universal Periodic Review, was meant to perform that critical function, and I believe that it has been launched successfully last year. Not perfectly, but successfully. And under that process, all member states of the United Nations will have their human rights records scrutinized on a periodic basis, in turn, starting with the members of the Council themselves. Unfortunately, the politicization of the new institution could not be avoided when it came to the treatment of human rights violations by the State of Israel. The structure of the agenda of the Council meetings and the breakout of the Lebanese war shortly after the creation of the new institution led to claims of disproportionate and undeserved focus on human rights violations by Israel. The voting patterns on draft resolutions emerging from both regular and special session of the Human Rights Council dealing with that issue speak volumes about the political treatment of the matter by most, if not all, members of the Council. In short, the Human Rights Council is what it is. It is a political body drawn more and more into the real world of human rights violations, not simply a debating forum for the elaboration or refinements of norms, principles, or standards. In contrast to the Security Council, its membership is broader and more varied, and no one has a veto. It has no coercive powers, as the Security Council does when it acts under Chapter 7 of the UN Charter. And yet, the Human Rights Council deals with quintessentially political issues, matters related to the way a state treats the people under its jurisdiction or under its de facto authority. And I stress, not just the way a state treats its citizens. Human rights apply to the treatment by states of all people under its jurisdiction or de facto authority. This is therefore a body of law that invites political posturing, particularly since the best defense against allegations of human rights violations is avoidance, obfuscation, and criticism of everybody else, including the system. And even more so when talk is cheap, because there are no binding outcomes to the deliberations of the Human Rights Council. Now, if we were really serious about implementation of human rights norms and standards on the international scene, I believe that we would have to be looking beyond the existing tripartite system, that is, the treaty body system, that these are the organs that oversee compliance with treaty obligations, the Human Rights Council, which I've described, a very political institution, and the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, a UN Secretariat body operating under the supervision of the Secretary General and of the General Assembly. The obvious missing part, the part that has given teeth to both European and Latin American human rights protection systems, is, of course, a human rights court. But there is no sign of movement in that direction at this stage, even in the boldest thinking about UN reform. And before this could be envisaged, I suggest that we would need a political climate considerably less confrontational on human rights issues, and we would need the leadership of those, like the United States, who would most likely be now amongst the most resistant to this idea. Now, as I conclude, let me turn back very briefly to the political climate. The climate that permeates the deliberations of the Human Rights Council reflects its political nature, which means that interests trump principles, and it reflects many ideological battles that rage within and between countries. I've already pointed out the fracture between freedom from fear and freedom from want. I've also alluded to the efforts that have been made in the last few years by many who are not particularly friendly to the cause of all human rights for all, to pit against each other the other two freedoms envisaged by Roosevelt, purporting, I suggest, to use a clash between freedom of expression and freedom of religion as a proxy for the so-called clashes of civilizations that are themselves nothing more than a repackaging of the North-South divide. Our chance for reform, for change, and progress are essentially dependent on the happy coincidence of people, ideas, and institutions. When the Human Rights Council was created in 2006, the General Assembly decided that its status would be reviewed in 5 years' time for the purpose of determining whether it should become a principal organ of the United Nations, on par with the General Assembly, the Security Council, and the International Court of Justice, or whether it should remain what it is today, which is a subsidiary body of the General Assembly. Now, such a change in the status of the Human Rights Council would, of course, require an amendment to the UN Charter, which I suggest is very unlikely to happen unless it piggybacks an amendment for the purpose of reforming the Security Council. But the mandated review of the status of the Human Rights Council by the General Assembly, which will take place in 2011, will be another opportunity for a broader human rights debate at the UN, a debate in which one has to hope to see the United States occupy a leading position of principle while being attentive to the uncomfortable, discordant discourse of a plurality of states that cannot be silenced or suppressed and that should not be ignored. There is probably no more challenging political issue for the international community than to seriously enhance the protection of all human rights for all. But there's also no issue that could have a greater impact, not only on the lives of everyone, but, as is the essence of human rights, first on the lives of those who need it the most. As we continue to deploy all efforts to prevent and to resolve conflicts, we must ensure that political expediency does not overtake the protection that international law extends directly to all human beings on the simple basis that we were all born equal in rights and in dignity. And that, I believe, as I'm sure you do, deserves our unconditional commitment. Thank you very much.
My name is Nick Vanderwall. I'm the director of the Inequality Center, which has organized this evening's talk. I'm going to take the questions for Mrs. Arbour. So, are there any questions? We have a microphone here. You want to? I guess. But is there just one mic? Yeah. So I guess we can ask people to line up or no more?
No, yeah.
Thank you very much for coming. I was interested, I know you mentioned at the beginning that you worked some with Human Rights Watch. Oh. And I was curious, to what extent do you think that non-governmental organizations have a role to play in combating human rights abuses, and how can they help work with organizations like the Human Rights Council to do so?
I think NGOs, non-governmental organizations, are absolutely critical, and if in fact, or when we engage in this revision of the Human Rights Council, I hope that there'll be very strong advocacy to enhance and to formalize, let's put it this way, the participation of non-governmental organizations at the table. On that issue, the human rights environment is already more friendly than other UN venues to civil society actors. Civil society organizations participate in the works of the Human Rights Council, but I would like to see, I think, a greater space for that. It's very, we still live in a world where state sovereignty occupies a very large place, and where the United Nations is based not only on the principle of, as I stressed here today, the equality of all human beings, but also based on the principle of the equality of states, all states, large and small. So the seats at the table formally are very much reserved for the 192 members of the UN. But I think we live in a world where the potency of the advocacy and the involvement and the service delivery by civil society actors cannot continue to be minimized in the formal political discourse. I mean, just to give you an example, and I'll move a little bit from the human rights to the humanitarian environment. At the height of the international community's involvement in Darfur, I hope we're still at the height, but I suspect that they may have been a little bit of scaling down in light of the attitude of the unwelcoming attitude of the government of the Sudan. But I think the ratio of civil society, NGO actors to UN actors was almost 10 to 1. For every UN person deployed in the field, there were 9 or 10 NGO actors. Now, the UN can play a role in coordinating all that, but the service delivery, the advocacy, the engagement, I think, comes overwhelmingly still by this tremendous political moving force of civil society. And I really hope in the human rights field that 2011 will be an occasion to call for a strengthening and a formalizing, an increase in civil society participation. Having said that, I chastise NGOs. I did very often during my tenure, in a friendly fashion, I should say, during my tenure as High Commissioner, because I really believe that there has to be, I know it's very difficult, but there has to be an effort at self-discipline in an environment in which we've seen an increase in what are called gongos, government NGOs, that is, under the appearance of civil society organizations, you have many that are completely overtaken, run, financed, governed, and whose agenda is set entirely to protect government interests. And that is poisoning, I think, the work of civil society actors. It's very difficult. Particularly the big international human rights NGOs are not keen to start policing their own community. But if they don't do it, then governments will do it. And we don't want governments to play, I think it has to be a question of self-governance for civil society actors. But it's very difficult.
Thank you very much for coming and for a very inspiring talk. You were skeptical about the possibility of a UN Court of Human Rights, and you spoke hopefully about the regional courts in Latin America, or in the Americas and in Europe, but you said nothing about the International Criminal Court, and I wonder if you excluded it because its mission is more narrow than human rights in general, or because you are not hopeful about its acceptance by the states?
Yeah, I'm very happy you asked, because I wouldn't want to leave you with any misapprehension about my level of enthusiasm for the International Criminal Court. My problem is very much, I think, the first one that you've alluded to. It is not a court for the enforcement or the application of all human rights for all. It has a very, very narrow mandate, as you know. First of all, let me say unquestionably, I think the progress we have made by calling to account in their personal capacities the worst human rights abusers is the greatest credit we could possibly have paid to the legacy of the Nuremberg trials. It took nearly 50 years of inertia, and then starting with the tribunals for the former Yugoslavia, for Rwanda, then the special court in Sierra Leone, currently the efforts to bring the Khmer Rouge to trial. I think all this, which then led to the enactment of the Rome Statute and the International Criminal Court, are to our collective immense credit in insisting on personal accountability, using criminal law as we do effectively in democratic systems to govern ourselves domestically, to use it as in the arsenal of peaceful resolution of conflict, of deterrence, of accountability, and as a forum for us collectively and unambiguously to state that we stand with the victims, that we reject the stigmatization of victims, and we will shift the stigmatization from victims to perpetrators. All that mission, I think, needs to be applauded. And again, I hope that there will come a time where we can persuade the American authorities to join the ranks of the many, now over 100 nations that have embraced the mandate and the mission of the International Criminal Court. But it remains, as you know, engaged solely in the personal prosecution for war crimes, crimes against humanity, so it's genocide, obviously. So it's far from being a forum in which victims of human rights abuses who've been denied, for instance, their freedom of movement, freedom of expression, and so on, can attempt to seek redress in a non-political environment. So I'm a big fan of the ICC, but I think what we have to look for is a more traditional, broad-based, broad-scope human rights court. But I want to make very clear, I'm usually a great optimist, but I don't see this one over the horizon in my lifetime.
Good evening, Ms. Arbour. It's an honor to get a chance to hear you speak, and thank you very much for coming here. In light of the fact that over the past year there's been all of this discussion on having potentially a female president in the White House, what do you think would be the chance and the effect, if any, of having a female Secretary General of the United Nations? Do you think that would help and in any way?
Well, let me maybe situate your question very, very broadly. I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but if I were, I mean, the level of gender discrimination and inequalities worldwide on the basis of gender is so universal to varying degrees, but it is so universal that one would be tempted to think that there's a kind of sinister hand at play that penetrates across cultures, across political systems, across prosperities and nations in keeping women away from their full place in their own governance, in the governance of their countries, in the fulfillment of their aspirations and rights. So I think we have to be very conscious of that. If there's one thing that is startling, we always say there's no hierarchy of rights, and I believe it's true. And when I say that, it's not in any way to diminish the plight of persons with disabilities, of persons who are either targeted for discriminatory practices, certainly not of the impact of race and ethnicity on the treatment that many people suffer at the hands of their own government and vis-a-vis the prejudices of their fellow human beings. I acknowledge all of that, and I think all these issues are very pressing. But it remains startling to see how universal gender inequality continues to be. Now, having said that, I think in the Western world, once again, we have put enormous emphasis on, I don't want to sound unduly critical, because even at that we haven't succeeded completely, but at the promotion of a few, as opposed to addressing the plight of the many. And maybe it was correct. Maybe that was the route to get there. We have advocated for a space for women to participate in public life, for occupying their, what I think they should be their right as anybody else, to reap the benefits of the private sector. But I'm not sure that we've addressed with equal vigor the necessity to lift the many women out of the poverty that is their plight, even in wealthy nations such as yours and mine. So I think we have to be careful not to view all our battles as symbolically represented by the success of failure of a few, and we should maybe very energetically redirect our attention to our sisters worldwide and in our own country, who I think, for whom a small progress would make a world of difference in their day-to-day lives. I didn't say anything about the chances of getting a women Secretary General, but you know, there's a very good NGO called Equality Now, based in this country. I think they operate out of New York, that in the last Secretary General search or election was promoting this idea, and in fact, very interestingly, had produced a name. You know, the answer always is, well, there's nobody qualified, as though, anyway, let me not get there. But had produced a very impressive list of dozens of women who would, let's put it mildly, would have been just as qualified as many of their male counterparts. I think, then, and one has to hope in the future.
Thank you very much. I was wondering, how do you see the Latin America human rights issue now? Because there's a court now. Do you think it has worked towards the advancement of human rights? And second, how do you see Colombia and the human rights situation, because the UN figures and the government figures always contradict themselves?
Well, again, it's very difficult to compare countries, and certainly in my work, I always took the position that we should never compare, we shouldn't rank the 192 member states of the UN in terms of their human rights compliance or performance. It seems to me the right question for any country is this country today in a state of progress or regression or stagnation on its human rights record? Not, is Sweden better than Botswana, which I don't think is going to tell you anything useful. Having said that, I think Latin America collectively holds currently some of the best promise for imaginative progress on human rights issues. For one thing, they've had a recent history of tremendous civil and political rights abuses, and they are very conscious of the importance that international pressure has had in pulling themselves out of these terrible predicaments, many of them. Secondly, it's the one part of the world in which there's at least an equal conversation on civil and political rights and economic, social, and cultural rights. It's very difficult to find equal enthusiasm. In Africa, for instance, you will find a willingness to embrace economic and social rights, a little more reluctance on this body of law that puts constraints on government action. So Latin America is full of promises. It has good NGO, good civil society. Again, I'm talking about a whole continent. There are exceptions. Some countries are in a better position than others. But globally, there's such a healthy human rights discourse. And I think the role that it's called the GRULAC, the Latin American and Caribbean group, can play in the international forum is probably the best one. They're very agile also at managing their differences. I mean, they don't always agree. By the time you put across the table, Bolivia, Mexico, Argentina, Venezuela, Ecuador, the Caribbean countries, and you put Brazil, and you put, for instance, the question of whether we should take an initiative to prevent discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation, you will find tremendous differences of opinion. But they're comfortable with managing that discordant discourse and engaging politically. And the court, I think, again, if you compare the other regions of the world, Asia has no regional court system at all. Africa has a very good one, but I think at this point it's mostly a paper exercise. It has yet to take roots in the community. So it's basically Europe and the Americas, but it's the Southern Americas, that have equipped themselves with that court. And when you visit small communities, as I did in Guatemala, for instance, you go to indigenous communities, they, as is very normal, first will seek to try to find redress in their national institutions. It's perfectly normal. It's cheaper, it's around the corner. But if they fail either in the political or the juridical forum of their own country, they will immediately mount a case before the Inter-American Court. By the time they start thinking of the international human rights environment in Geneva, it's very remote. So I think we really need to promote and to engage with reinforcing these regional mechanisms. People deal with their neighbors much more effectively than try to deal with the whole world.
Thanks so much for your explanation of how the universality of human rights is compatible with cultural diversity. I have a question related to that. I was recently talking to a human rights activist from Burma who was explaining to me that the word that's usually translated as rights in Burmese really means permission. It's permission that someone gives you. It's not an inborn universal right. And so she and her colleagues were really running into difficulties with whether to use the English term human rights, whether to use this existing term in their own language, or whether to try to come up with a new term. And I wonder how common this problem is, and if so, what other groups have done about that.
This is very interesting. I'll just make two observations. The first one is I believe tremendously in language as a political vehicle. In fact, one of the many battles that I pathetically lost during my tenure as High Commissioner was my attempt to have the word human rights in French reflect the current modern political reality by having it called literally human rights as opposed to men's right, which is currently literally the way it's translated. Human rights in the international environment is called les droits de l'homme, and historically it was the same thing in Spanish. It was called derechos del hombre, and then it was changed to derechos humanos. The French have mounted a terrible resistance to this idea on the basis, essentially, that they've invented human rights, and it's going to stay exactly the way they said it, and we all know that everything men have, women can have too, kind of theory. Certainly in my own country, or French is my first language, we have always believed in the importance of language as a political vehicle. And when I now go back home and I inadvertently refer to les droits de l'homme, I risk being stoned to death by people who think I've regressed 20 years in my incorrect use of language. I say that to say I think it's really critical to develop, to invent a language. I also believe that we must feminize titles and so on to reflect, if not the current reality, at least our aspirations for what it should be. If I had to give any advice, I would say just invent a terminology, but don't yield to the limitations contained in a language that reflects the existing structures of power. Having said that, it's not surprising, it's revealing of how far one has to go in claiming an environment for essential fundamental rights when it's the language itself reflects, I think, a history of state dominance. And I didn't know that, but I'm not surprised, and I think it would be really great to encourage the use of more appropriate language.
Your thoughts on Guantanamo Bay?
Oh. Well, I'll go back to the beginning of my tenure as High Commissioner, so 4.5 years ago. At that point, I had a lot of concerns, but the concerns that I expressed, for the most part, were the following. What I found unconscionable about the existence of Guantanamo Bay was the deliberate attempt by one branch of governance in the United States to completely dismiss the role of another important branch of governance, which was the courts. So to create an environment in which essentially the executive could shield itself from the scrutiny of what, in my view, is its partner branch in the governance of the country, which is judicial review. So my main issue with Guantanamo was the attempt to operate in a lawless environment, what has been described as the legal black hole. Now, this was, I think, in the last 4 years, remedied by the courts reoccupying, asserting their jurisdiction. One may agree or disagree with the outcome of any particular case, but the fact that the courts have reoccupied their oversight position is, I think, immense and very welcome progress, and has defeated this attempt to, in my view, pervert the fundamentals of democracy, of the sophisticated democracy that people are entitled to rely on in this country. This is the first thing. The second thing, I think, Guantanamo was also a metaphor for the unprecedented amount of secrecy that we have collectively in the United States, but in the ally countries that have supported the United States, the incredible, unprecedented amount of secrecy that we have tolerated by letting governments to do things on our behalf or in our name, abdicating our own responsibility as citizens to scrutinize what is being done in our name and on our behalf. So, and this is in parallel to, bypassing judicial review and then bypassing public opinion by operating, not even saying, for instance, answering the simple questions, are there other places like that? That is this country in partnership with others operating as yet undisclosed, i.e. secret detention facilities in which people are held incommunicado? And so we've, I think, have tolerated a tremendous amount of secrecy which undermines our capacity as citizens to give instructions to our governments. And I say us because, led by the United States, there are many others. In fact, as we speak, there is in Canada a report that has been released, I think this afternoon, examining, it's the continued examination of the role that Canada may have played in not extending its protection to its own citizens who alleged to have been detained in these undisclosed facilities, I think. So these are, I think, the two fundamental issues. There are many legal questions related to Guantanamo that I think will continue to cause tremendous difficulty and tremendous damage, not only on the persons who have been submitted to that process, and it's very hard to tell whether all of them deserved anything resembling the treatment that they have suffered, because again, there's been no judicial accounting for the reasons why they are there and for the manner in which they are being treated. But I think it leaves, I think, the government now in this no exit strategy position. What is going to happen to these people? Why is it not closed now? I think it's because nobody has any idea of what can legally happen to have these cases processed under anything resembling due process of law. So not a very happy story, I'm afraid.
Hi. Human rights means not only individual rights, but also the rights of a group of people. So I'm wondering, I'm really curious about the contradiction between the promotion of human rights and self-determination, which is the right of a group of people to decide their own future. So I'm wondering, what's your opinion and what's the opinion of the United Nations on the idea that idea of subverting a government for the purpose of human rights promotion?
This is very difficult. The question of self-determination, first of all, it is a fundamental human rights. The rights, it goes a little bit to what I've mentioned before, that there's the right to one's culture, one's language, the right to associate with others is a fundamental human rights. It's part of who we are as social animals. And the right to self-determination is also a fundamental right of people. The danger, though, is that the right to self-determination does not automatically translate into an entitlement to territorial sovereignty over, it's not a geographic concept, let's put it this way. So the right to self-determination can be, in law, entirely satisfied within the context of a state where this group is a minority, for instance, as long as it is treated adequately and its status as a minority is fully protected. Now, when you do human rights work, certainly in all the work I did, the one discourse or dialogue that is virtually impossible to engage in, certainly as an international civil servant with any country, is anything that threatens the territorial integrity of a state. I've had excellent discussions with Russia, with China, with Morocco, but the one areas that are the least comfortable to engage in are Chechnya, Tibet, the Western Sahara, anything that goes at the heart of what the state perceives to be its territorial integrity is hands-off for the advancement of human rights. But as I said, it's really important to stress that the right to self-determination doesn't mean you have the right to have your own country. And this could be no more clear than in a country like Canada, for instance, that has dealt for decades, certainly throughout my entire adult life, with the national aspirations of French-speaking Canadians, particularly in Quebec, but also in an environment in which we have a very important and hugely neglected Aboriginal population. There's not much to be gained by a debate as to what belongs to whom and who was there first if we're talking about transforming automatically the right to self-determination into a geographic claim. I think it's a cultural claim, it's a rights-based claim, but it can be accommodated by many, many ways, and in some cases, independence or actual state sovereignty is the inevitable and only appropriate environment to protect that right. That certainly was the opinion of the international community at large, not everybody, in the case of Kosovo, for instance. You know, that there may come a point where the rights of a minority in a country, often a majority in its own territory, can no longer be properly accommodated, either in a federal system or any other form of political arrangement, and full sovereignty over a territory will then be viewed by the international community as the appropriate, the only appropriate measure. It's a very complicated, there are several, I think, subjects in international governance that are just very difficult. Self-determination, the definition of the crime of aggression in war crimes is another example of where it's very difficult to have a consensus, and it's very case-specific as to what it means and how it needs to be implemented.
We have time for one more question. Let's see, in the back there, the lady.
Thank you so much. Well, thank you so much for your inspiring speech. You speak of this clash between human rights, which intrinsically embody the freedom of religion, and the freedom of religion itself. How do you suggest enforcing human rights to combat crimes that are fundamentally justified by religion, such as honor crimes or honor killings in the Middle East and female genital mutilation in North Africa?
Yeah. Frankly, on these two examples, I think there is no accommodation that the state can make to actions that are said to be based on religious practices. I think that's where one has to draw the line. And frankly, I think there's probably a general acceptance of the idea. Now, the tolerance for these activities is still very high, but I'm not sure enough about genital mutilation to speak authoritatively, but I suspect that you're not going to find governments who will stand up, for instance, for the principle of honor killing or genital mutilation. They will try to defend their inability to eradicate these practices because they're so ingrained in tradition or in religious at times. Usually it's kind of tradition and cultural values. So I think for one thing, we have to insist that they be prohibited by law. The legal protection is absolutely fundamental. There has to be first a legal framework. Even if it's not applied, we have to advocate for a legal framework of protection. And then I think we have to advocate with governments that the laws have to be enforced. And the best way to do that, in my opinion, is to empower national groups to work, for instance, with women. It's very difficult to do that from the outside without looking as cultural imperialist or neo-colonial visionaries. But I think to accompany and show our solidarity and support those inside the system who are fighting these practices is absolutely critical. But I think we should have no ambivalence
in saying that the fundamental principle of the right to physical integrity is not the subject of negotiation on the basis of cultural or traditional practices.